Ancient magic, ancient mysteries. When I awoke, I was on board a ship. I could hear the creak of the boards, smell the sea. I could smell the blood of those who manned the ship, and I knew that it was a galley, because I could hear the rhythm of the oars under the low rumbling of the giant canvas sails. I couldn't open my eyes, couldn't make my limbs move, yet I was calm. I didn't thirst. In fact, I experienced an extraordinary sense of peace. My body was warm as if I had only just fed, and it was pleasant to lie there to dream, waking dreams, on the gentle undulation of the sea. Then my mind began to clear. I knew that we were slipping very fast through rather still waters, and that the sun had just gone down. The early evening sky was darkening, the wind was dying away, and the sound of the oars dipping and rising was as soothing as it was clear. My eyes were now open. I was no longer in the coffin. I had just come out of the rear cabin of the long vessel, and I was standing on the deck. I breathed the fresh salt air, and I saw the lovely incandescent blue of the twilight sky and the multitude of brilliant stars overhead. Never from land do the stars look like that. Never are they so near. There were dark mountainous islands on either side of us, cliffs sprinkled with tiny flickering lights. The air was full of the scent of green things, of flowers, of land itself, and the small sleek vessel was moving fast to a narrow pass through the cliffs ahead. I felt uncommonly clear-headed and strong. There was a moment's temptation to try to figure out how I had gotten here, whether I was in the Aegean or the Mediterranean itself, to know when we had left Cairo and if the things I remembered had really taken place. But this slipped away from me in some quiet acceptance of what was happening. Marius was up ahead on the bridge before the mainmast. I walked towards the bridge and stood beside it looking up. He was wearing the long red velvet cloak he had worn in Cairo, and his full white blonde hair was blown back by the wind. His eyes were fixed on the pass before us, the dangerous rocks that protruded from the shallow water, his left hand gripping the rail of the little deck. I felt an overpowering attraction to him, and the sense of peace in me expanded. There was no forbidding grandeur to his face or his stance, no loftiness that might have humbled me and made me afraid. There was only a quiet nobility about him. His eyes, rather wide as they looked forward, the mouth suggesting a disposition of exceptional gentleness as before. Too smooth the face, yes, it had the sheen of scar tissue. It was so smooth that it might have startled, even frightened in a dark street. It gave off a faint light, but the expression was too warm, too human in its goodness, to do anything but invite. Armand might have looked like a god out of Caravaggio, Gabriel a marble archangel at the threshold of a church, but this figure above me was that of an immortal man. And the immortal man, with his right hand outstretched before him, was silently but unmistakably piloting the ship through the rocks before the pass. The waters around us shimmered like molten metal, flashing azure, then silver, then black. They sent up a great white froth as the shallow waves beat upon the rocks. I drew closer, and as quietly as I could, I climbed the small steps to the bridge. Marius didn't take his eyes off the waters for an instant, but he reached out with his left hand and took my hand, which was at my side. Warmth, unobtrusive pressure, but this wasn't the moment for speaking, and I was surprised that he had acknowledged me at all. His eyebrows came together and his eyes narrowed slightly, and, as if impelled by his silent command, the oarsmen slowed their stroke. I was fascinated by what I was watching, and I realized as I deepened my own concentration that I could feel the power emanating from him, a low pulse that came in time with his heart. I could also hear mortals on the surrounding cliffs and on the narrow island beaches, stretching out to our right and to our left. I saw them gathered on the promontories or running towards the edge of the water with torches in their hands. I could hear thoughts ringing out like voices from them as they stood in the thin evening darkness looking out to the lanterns of our ship. The language was Greek and not known to me, but the message was clear. The Lord is passing. Come down and look, the Lord is passing. And the word Lord incorporated in some vague way the supernatural in its meaning, and a reverence mingled with excitement emanated like a chorus of overlapping whispers from the shores. I was breathless listening to this. I thought of the mortal I terrified in Cairo, the old debacle on Renaud's stage. But for those two humiliating incidents, I'd passed through the world invisibly for 10 years. And these people, these dark-clad peasants gathered to watch the passing of the ship, knew what Marius was, or at least they knew something of what he was. They were not saying the Greek word for vampire, which I had come to understand, but we were leaving the beaches behind. The cliffs were closing on either side of us. The ship glided with its oars above water. The high walls diminished the sky's light. In a few moments I saw a great silver bay opening before us, and a sheer wall of rock, rising straight ahead, while gentler slopes enclosed the water on either side. The rock face was so high and so steep that I could make out nothing at the top. The oarsmen cut their speed as we came closer. The boat was turning ever so slightly to the side, and as we drifted on towards the cliff I saw the dim shape of an old stone embankment covered with gleaming moss. The oarsmen had lifted their oars straight towards the sky. Marius was as still as ever, his hand exerting a gentle force on mine, as with the other he pointed towards the embankment and the cliff that rose like the night itself, our lanterns sending up their glare on the wet rock. When we were no more than 5 or 6 feet from the embankment, dangerously close for a ship of this size and weight, it seemed I felt the ship stop. Then Marius took my hand and we went across the deck together and mounted the side of the ship. A dark-haired servant approached and placed a sack in Marius's hand, and together Marius and I leapt over the water to the stone embankment, easily clearing the distance without a sound. I glanced back to see the ship rocking slightly. The oars were being lowered again. Within seconds, the ship was heading for the distant lights of a tiny town on the far side of the bay. Marius and I stood alone in the darkness, and when the ship had become only a dark speck on the glimmering water, he pointed to a narrow stairway cut into the rock. "Go before me, Lestat," he said. It felt good to be climbing. It felt good to be moving up swiftly, following the rough-cut steps and the zigzag turns, and feeling the wind get stronger and seeing the water become ever more distant and frozen, as if the movement of the waves had been stopped. Marius was only a few steps behind me, and again I could feel and hear that pulse of power. It was like a vibration in my bones. The rough-cut steps disappeared less than halfway up the cliff, and I was soon following a path not wide enough for a mountain goat. Now and then boulders or outcroppings of stone made a margin between us and a possible fall to the water below, but most of the time the path itself was the only outcropping on the cliff face, and as we went higher and higher, even I became afraid to look down. Once with my hand around a tree branch, I looked back and saw Marius moving steadily towards me, the bag slung over his shoulder, his right hand hanging free. The bay, the distant little town, and the harbor, all this appeared toy-like, a map made by a child on a tabletop, with a mirror and sand and tiny bits of wood. I could even see beyond the pass into the open water, and the deep shadowy shapes of other islands rising out of the motionless sea. Marius smiled and waited, then he whispered very politely, "Go on." I must have been spellbound. I started up again, and didn't stop until I reached the summit. I crawled over a last jut of rocks and weeds and climbed to my feet in soft grass. Higher rocks and cliffs lay ahead, and seeming to grow out of them was an immense fortress of a house. There were lights in its windows, lights on its towers. Marius put his arm around my shoulder, and we went towards the entrance. I felt his grip loosen on me as he paused in front of the massive door. Then came the sound of a bolt sliding back inside. The door swung open, and his grip became firm again. He guided me into the hallway where a pair of torches provided an ample light. I saw with a little shock that there was no one there who could have moved the bolt or opened the door for us. He turned and he looked at the door, and the door closed. "Slide the bolt," he said. I wondered why he didn't do it the way he had done everything else, but I put it in place immediately as he asked. "It's easier that way, by far," he said, and a little mischief came into his expression. "I'll show you to the room where you may sleep safely, and you may come to me when you wish." I could hear no one else in the house, but mortals had been here, that I could tell. They'd left their scent here and there, and the torches had all been lighted only a short time ago. We went up a little stairway to the right, and when I came out into the room that was to be mine, I was stunned. It was a huge chamber with one entire wall open to a stone-railed terrace that hung over the sea. When I turned around, Marius was gone, the sack was gone, but Nicky's violin and my valise of belongings lay on a stone table in the middle of the room. A current of sadness and relief passed through me at the sight of the violin. I had been afraid that I had lost it. There were stone benches in the room, a lighted oil lamp on a stand, and in a far niche was a pair of heavy wooden doors. I went to these and opened them and found a little passage which turned sharply in an L. Beyond the bend was a sarcophagus with a plain lid. It had been cleanly fashioned out of diorite, which to my knowledge is one of the hardest stones on earth. The lid was immensely heavy, and when I examined the inside of it, I saw that it was plated in iron and contained a bolt that could be slipped from within. Several glittering objects lay on the bottom of the box shelf. As I lifted them, they sparkled almost magically in the light that leaked in from the room. There was a golden mask, its features carefully molded, the lips closed, the eye holes narrow but open, attached to a hood made up of layered plates of hammered gold. The mask itself was heavy, but the hood was very light and very flexible, each little plate strung to the others by gold thread. And there was also a pair of leather gloves covered completely in tinier, more delicate gold plates like scales. And finally a large folded blanket of the softest red wool, with one side sewn with larger gold plates. I realized that if I put on this mask and these gloves, if I laid over me the blanket, then I would be protected from the light if anyone opened the lid of the sarcophagus while I slept. But it wasn't likely that anyone could get into the sarcophagus. And the doors of this L-shaped chamber were also covered with iron, and they too had their iron bolt. Yet there was a charm to these mysterious objects. I liked to touch them, and I pictured myself wearing them as I slept. The mask reminded me of the Greek masks of comedy and tragedy. All of these things suggested the burial of an ancient king. I left these things a little reluctantly. I came back out into the room, took off the garments I'd worn during my nights in the earth in Cairo, and put on fresh clothes. I felt rather absurd standing in this timeless place in a violet blue frock coat, with pearl buttons, and the usual lace shirt and diamond buckle satin shoes. But these were the only clothes I had. I tied back my hair in a black ribbon, like any proper 18th century gentleman, and went in search of the master of the house.